This is an unexpected pleasure. We're honored by your presence.
You may dispense with the pleasantries, Commander. I'm here to put you back on schedule.
I assure you, Lord Vader, my men are working as fast as they can.
Perhaps I can find new ways to motivate them.
I tell you, this station will be operational as planned.
The Emperor does not share your optimistic appraisal of the situation.
But he asks the impossible. I need more men.
Then perhaps you can tell him when he arrives.
The Emperor's coming here?
That is correct, Commander. And he is most displeased with your apparent lack of progress.
We shall double our efforts.
I hope so, Commander, for your sake. The Emperor is not as forgiving as I am.
Welcome, Masters and Padawans, to a special episode of Full of Sith. This is episode 622. I'm your host, Bryan Young. Got something really cool for you. We've got from the archives the interview I did in 2021 with Nilo Rodis Jamero, who was the costume designer for Return of the Jedi and just a general art designer and for Empire Strikes Back. I remember really just digging all of his designs and illustrations going back to when I was a kid, flipping through all the art books and stuff that I did alongside his work with Joe Johnston, and just really enjoying it. He did some of my favorite designs in Star Wars, whether that was the Scout Trooper in Return of the Jedi, or the Imperial Royal Guards, or just some of the most iconic designs in Star Wars. And he's not a name that you hear as much as many of the others that you hear as far as, like, some of the great designs in Star Wars, the designers in Star Wars, you know. But I was able to track him down for an interview I did for Star Wars Insider, and I was only able to use just a taste of it. And so as we're looking at, you know, the end of Star Wars Insider over the next couple of months, which is something that still really bummed about. Thought it would be cool to listen to some of these unabridged, interviews. And, today with the release, we've got a new trailer for Mando and Grogu. And as soon as Holly and I get back together, we'll be able to do some deep dives into it, but I can say I am fully on board and cannot wait to see this movie. Wow, Embo's back. And I can only imagine how much Holly lost it with the sight of that little baby Rodian. Anyway, without further ado, here's that interview with Nilo Rodis Jamero and all of the other weird places that we took that interview. Some of it's a little not Star Wars. We kind of got into where he went after he left Lucasfilm and left film in general. We got into everything from Howard the Duck and his work there to his work with John Hughes and David Lynch, and there's some really interesting stuff in here. So here you go. Thanks again for speaking with me, and I just want to just start out by asking. It's probably a story you've told a lot, but just how you got involved with Lucasfilm in the first place. I read somewhere you were, designing tanks at the time.
Yeah, and I get a call. I believe it was from Joe Johnston. And met up with George at that time at somewhere in San Rafael, and didn't know much about it other than I wanted to get out of my old job, so anything will be fine. digging ditches would be good. So, I interviewed me. I went up there, with my canned presentation, and he wasn't really paying attention to my presentation. Instead, he was looking at my school portfolio. He was more interested in, what was going on at school for me. So anyway, the next thing I know, I'm offered a job, and I didn't know that movies are designed at that time, since I didn't know much about movies. But anyway, he assured me that since I do tangible products like tanks or cars or boats, something that you can touch, now all I have to do was design intangible products for him. Products that are not necessarily consumed by using, but rather by seeing.
I've read that you said that he asked if you like science fiction or books or movies in general, and your answer to all three was sort of no.
Well, I was not really into movies or into science fiction books. I was into history books. So when he asked me halfway during my presentation, he asked me, he sort of interrupted me and said, "Do you like science fiction books?" And I said, "No." And I went on to my presentation. And then he said, he interrupted me again, and he said, do you like science fiction movies? And I thought, it's really weird question, no, because I don't. And then finally he said, well, do you like movies? And I told him no. I preferred books. And at the time, I was not into movies, and especially science fiction movies. So what he was really looking for was somebody that could design something, and I think still malleable. Didn't have any preconceived notion of what movie design is, and in many respects, I think I fit that bill since I didn't know anything. So that's how.
When you got the job, I read that you raced out to go see Star Wars at that point, just to kind of figure out what you're getting into. Is that a fair assessment? And how did that first viewing of Star Wars land with you?
I thought that's a design movie. Clearly everything was designed. The costume was designed, the spaceship was designed, the set was designed, the lighting was designed. Everything was manufactured. Whereas before, when I saw movies, I really believed it happening in front of me. I never thought of it being designed or being lit or, the sequence like this. But that one clearly hit me as being a designed, quote-unquote, movie.
As you're sitting there watching it for the first time as a designer, was there any specific design in there that struck you as something that made you go like, okay, I made the right decision here?
I don't know if I ever thought I made the right decision. I just thought it was a very exciting world, designing that world. What I loved about what I saw about Star Wars was how lived in it was. It was not clean. It was used. So it was believable that way, and I started to realize that too, that acceptance of that feeling of a world that has been used, or is being used. I said, so that's what design is in movies.
As you started to work at Lucasfilm, you came in for Empire Strikes Back. What was the environment there around that time? What were you stepping into?
I was stepping into George's house, and it's just and then there was a house that he bought next door that Joe and I occupied. Joe occupied the upper floor, and I occupied the lower floor. And I have no idea what movies are. I have no idea how movies are designed, how movies are made. I just know that there's a guy named George and there's a guy named Joe, and for some reason or another, I'm led to believe that we're making movies. I never read the script, never saw a script, and Joe never really told me what to do. He just, we went to an art store and got some supplies, and I sat there wondering, okay, so what do I do next? And, every afternoon or so, George would show up by himself, and we would chat, and didn't really know what the chat was about, and then he would walk away, and I thought, okay, so I have no idea, what I'm supposed to be doing here. So pretty soon those chats took on a form of sequences of ideas of, there is this, the rebel had gathered in an icy planet, and the Empire's going to come over and kick ass, and what would it look like? So it started that way, but not quick, not like assignments. It's like I'm thinking something like along this line, and you're supposed to chime in. What do you see? What do you picture?
Did that feel freeing to you or frustrating?
I felt nothing. I just thought that this is the way movies are made. Someone comes up to you and has this idea that he's still, hammering away in his head, and he's sharing it with you. And I know I'm not there to make music. That's not my job. So I go, somewhere along those, within that chat, I'm supposed to come up with some visual cues. So, just start sketching away, and the following day he shows up and he goes, yeah, that's really nice, and something like that, and another chat, another story. It's disconnected stories. It's not sequential stories, and I'm not really sure. Sometimes it meant anything, or he would just kind of goofing off, or or taking some time off and having a chat. And then pretty soon, concept sketches starts piling up. And, and then Ralph McQuarrie showed up one day, and Ralph has this postage stamp size paintings that are complete, a complete picture of a frozen scene, like right out of a film, complete with lighting, with color, with everything. Whereas Joe and I were just sketching away with ballpoint pens, or I was. So, pretty soon, it's sort of like building blocks, some sort of design direction is shaped, and we follow that, and then we iterate on it, and then, sometimes it goes away somewhere, it disappears, and sometimes it comes back, and sometimes it just doesn't work, and, but there is no, from my experience later on in movie making, it is totally different from, say, you go to Hollywood, they give you a script and it's all ready to go. and you have to visualize that script, and you have to put numbers on that script. What would it cost to make that script? And that script is already hammered. It's already done. You just back into it, sort of. Whereas my experience with George was free, how do you say that? Free association.
Mm-hmm.
I have this idea, and you go, no.
How did that change and evolve as the production got closer? Like I've read, and please correct me if I'm wrong, but that you'd also worked on some of the storyboards and whatnot on Empire.
Yeah. How did as ideas begin to take shape, as a concept begin to take shape, how did the Empire attack the rebel forces at Hoth? So you start visualizing that, and I visualize that from a product design point of view. They would have a ship like this, and the ship would have little ships, and the little ship would contain 14 people, 17 people, or whatever, and then they would hover, and then they would fly. And then you start sequencing that, because that idea alone, sitting there, doesn't do anything. So you start sequencing it from, I think this is how they drop it off from the plane, from the mothership, and then from the mothership, this is how they would glide. And, and the rebel forces sees it from a distance, and pretty soon you're storyboarding it,
mm-hmm.
right? And it's still very rough visualization, and out of that, that's honed in tighter and tighter and tighter and tighter. And I remember about a year into pre-production, we gathered all the storyboards together, and a bunch of people showed up, and I didn't know at that time, but there was a number of technical Oscar winners in that meeting room. Dennis Murin, Richard Edlund, all of these people. I didn't know them, So now we had a complete storyboard, and the storyboard is broken into sequences. This is Hoth, and after the Battle of Hoth, we went to Dagobah, and still very rough, but the story is now there so that it can be told now cohesively to people that's never seen it before. And at that time, that meeting was these people were gathered so that they can look at the idea, the concept of, and they were to imagine how they would technically break it down so that we could do this movie from a visual design concept or visual effects concept, because all of them were visual effects people. So once they sign off that it can be done, we could do this, we could do that, then that storyboard is honed down even tighter. Now, and up to that time, I had not seen a script yet. It's just storytelling. It's just series of storytelling with George and Joe doing sequences. I'm doing sequences. Ralph doing conceptual design, and gathered together to become storyboard. This is not a shooting storyboard yet. This is just conceptual storyboard that kind of does a rough first coat of the paint,
mm-hmm.
And then it's shipped to, it shifts to production, and following storyboard ideas. Then the director on location then has his own storyboard to hone in those sequences even tighter. And as we see those scenes come into film, we start looking at the post-production. how do we storyboard the post-production based on those production dailies that we have seen, or the production rushes, or the first edit? How does the ship really come in? How do we really do this in post-production now? So the storyboard never ends from beginning to end.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I mean, for that movie anyway.
One thing I want to ask, and maybe it touches on something that you said earlier, is you talked about being really much more interested in history than science fiction, and design throughout history has always told a story, and I'm wondering how you were able to take your knowledge of history and apply that to be able to tell stories with your design.
I don't know if I fully understand the question.
Well, just in Star Wars, right? You can look at a piece, and especially in the further movies where the design is sort of predicated on previous designs too. Like looking at the design and looking at the history of those designs, you can kind of track that evolution among them. And sometimes, like in Star Wars, when you skip a whole bunch of time ahead, the change in the design itself can tell a story. Was that anything that you were worried about, or was it just sort of we're just going to make things look cool?
It has never been anything about making it look cool. Okay. Perhaps a better way of explaining this was when I was asked to design custom design a Jedi. Now at that time, John Molo was designing costume,
mm-hmm.
and the history of me getting that job as a costume designer is another story by itself. But looking at John Molo's design, I was beholden to John Molo's design. It was my job to make sure that the continuity of his design, it has a thread all the way to whatever design I'm going to do. So I have to design something on Empire, on Jedi. I have to look back again. How did John Molo did this? I cannot have a sheer line, a design sheer line where it just suddenly shear off and it's another world. Another way of explaining it is, when I had my first meeting with Paramount, and they were really concerned that I came from Star Wars.
Mm-hmm.
And I didn't, that kind of puzzled me. It's kind of like saying I came from General Motors, and therefore all my design would look like General Motors cars. No, my design is cars, and that story in itself is, let me jump back in time. How did I get to General Motors? I don't like cars. I was never passionate about cars. I don't understand cars. But yet somehow General Motors hired me to design cars. By the time I got to Detroit, to Michigan, because for industrial designers, the holy grail was General Motors at that era. So when I got there, they had to teach me design, how to design cars. Now, so applying that to me arriving at Paramount and thinking, I'm a clean slate. I don't have any conceptual idea of what Star Trek is because I've never seen Star Trek. But their concern was, I'm Star Wars. And I go, that Star Wars is a design vocabulary. It's a design language that belongs to Star Wars. That design language with General Motors is General Motors. We are now designing Porsches. So our design language is German, it's Porsches, it's rear engine, it's this. I can design, it's totally different design language. And I'm trying to explain to them, that you need not worry about it.
Mm-hmm.
So, how did we get here? I'm a designer, and I think the reason Joe reached out to me because I have the same background as Joe, as I have the same background as Ralph. But the three of us were industrial designers.
Mm-hmm.
So we have design language. Now, the two of them have previously worked on Star Wars, so I had to catch up to the design language of Star Wars. I had to catch up to the design language of General Motors when I got there. But it didn't mean that I didn't know how to design. I just didn't know how to design cars.
Mm-hmm.
So, does that sort of answer your question?
Yes, it does. It does. I'm curious about, as we talk about these design languages among projects, do they change? Was you worked on Raiders of the Lost Ark? How did your experience on that differ from your experience on Empire as far as how that iterative process went?
By that time, I kind of understood how movies are made. I could not. I'm not well versed in film at that time yet because my experience in film was strictly George, and George as a filmmaker is spectacularly different from everybody else. George makes movies differently from everybody else. So the only baseline that I know about Raiders was that it's a radio serial. So I had to listen. I had to go back in time. What is a radio serial? So I literally listened to radio serial and then watch old Flash Gordon serials and go, oh, I get it. So armed with that, yeah, okay, this is Raiders, a cliffhanger serial.
How did you make that jump from Empire to Raiders? What was the transition between the two for you?
There is none. You're doing Empire. Empire is done, and hey Nilo, we're doing Raiders of the Lost Ark. Okay, that's it. And Raiders is explained again like a serial, and I remember doing the way I approached it was looking at old movie posters, to capture that serial quality, and I remember the way I entered into that world was designing a one sheet for Raiders of the Lost Ark. I'm just imagining. There's no script. So I'm just kind of imagining what Raiders of the Lost Ark is.
There probably wasn't even a title at that point?
No, there was a title. It was Raiders of the Lost Ark, and it was Joe and I worked on it briefly, and then it went to Spielberg. And then the entire production was done, and then Joe and I did some posts on it. But initially, the initial concept design was with Joe and I, before it went to Steven.
So you didn't. Your process on Raiders was very much the same as your process in Star Wars, and then when Steven Spielberg came in to do it, it went through Spielberg's normal process, and you and Joe Johnston just sort of moved on to the next thing?
We started looking into the post-production of that of Raiders.
Mm-hmm. Can you tell me about Return of the Jedi and sort of stepping into that, and then how you got the costume design gig?
So, in between Empire and Jedi, I don't know exactly how many years, I think 3 years, Joe, Ralph, and I were separated by many projects. I was working on something else, and Joe was working on something else. And we would run into each other in the hallway, or, I would see Ralph now and then socially. But we were not in the same room doing the same thing. And one day, the three of us were in the same room. And, I remember asking Ralph, what are you doing here? Joe, what are you doing here? We were told to be here. All three of us were told to be here. So I thought, wow, I know what this is. We all know what this was. This is going to be Jedi. This is going to be the next Star Wars. So I remember we had our own coffee maker, in the art department. So I remember making a pot of coffee, sharpening up my pen, lining up my bond paper, setting up for a long meeting. George walks in. He didn't let go of the door handle as he walks in. He walked in, but instead of closing the door, he's hanging onto the door handle. And we're all looking at him. I'm literally pouring coffee on my cup when he walks in. And he says, there are 7 highlights to this story. The Rebel Alliance gathered, the Han is rescued, blah, 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 blah. See you guys in 2 weeks.
Not a lot to go on.
But when you watch the movie, that's exactly what the movie is. It has the 7 highlights. And out of those 7 highlights, as a designer, I started asking myself, how is Han rescued? So how is he captured? What is that place? Who guards him? What is that place? So that process begins. And how does he escape? And George will not tell you how he escapes, how he's rescued. And the Rebel Alliance gather. Where? How? Where? It doesn't explain that. But when you watch the movie, that's what guides that movie, those 7 highlights. So whenever, after that, I'm always looking for the key highlights of any script. What holds this script together? As a designer, what holds this script together for me? And when I became production design, I'm always looking for those key points in movies. And, the most complicated design assignment I would take for myself, and the rest I would assign to my art directors, so that they begin to have experience to become production designers. So the process literally was that, there are 7 highlights to this story. See you guys in 2 weeks. Now, I'm not going to come up with music. I'm going to come up with, this is what looks like Han's prison cell or whatever. And these are the people, and this is how he escapes. And, and Ralph would present his version, and Joe would present his version, and Joe would just, and George would just sit there, and he would red mark the ones that, the visual ideas he understood or he likes. And he never explained, why he red dotted certain things and why he ignored other things. And so we have to, when he leaves, we look at, why did he like that? And so whatever he red dotted, we would expand on it. we would iterate on it. And then 2 weeks later, he would show up and, on and on and on.
With Empire and Jedi, was it always George you were working with primarily during this phase, or at what point did Irvin Kershner or Richard Marquand come in, and what was the difference between the two? The difference was, for me on Empire, I kind of came in late. The production was already up and running, or the pre-production was already up and running. So I had to catch up with Joe and Ralph as to where they were at and how do I slip behind them and keep up my speed. With Jedi, the three of us were at the same starting block, and by that time I kind of have an idea how George works because I've done, a couple of movies with him, including Raiders. So I kind of know his processes. So Richard was introduced to us when early on when George was still looking for a director, whereas Kershner was already involved in production when I came in. So I think the other guy that he was entertaining was David Lynch. Mm-hmm. He brought in David, to so got to know David, got to know Richard, and then Joe and I would, when Richard was hired, Joe and I would work independent of each other on different sequences. So we would have separate meeting with Richard, and Joe would take on a certain sequence, and I would take on a certain sequence, and it was just the two of us, ping-ponging different sequences. Mm-hmm. So I never got to know Kershner really well as I did with Richard. And he's the one who sort of pushed the idea of you taking over the costume design, right?
Yeah. I remember being shook up about it because, no, that's not what I do. It's well, your storyboard already has costume. Before I do storyboard, I do sequence. I do designs on the side, right? What does Lando's disguise look like, and how does he blend in with the rest of the people? So I would do all of these individual people, individual characters, and then bring in into storyboards. So what Richard saw was enough of a clue for him that maybe I could design costume. Mm. So he pushed that idea to George, and George kept saying no, and I'm kind of caught between the two of them because I'm okay. I can, whatever. I didn't know that pre-production has nothing to do with post-production, and pre-production and post-production had nothing to do with production. That's so separate in most movies. Right? You do production, you do design, but you don't do pre-production, and you do pre-production, but you don't do post-production. We did all of that because it was all in-house, and we did all of that without a script until much later on. Mm-hmm. So I got to know Richard very well because he spent most of the time doing pre-production, in San Rafael.
Did that cause tension, the idea that they'd be using a different costume designer than the first two movies?
I'm naive enough to, I'm stupid naive enough to not know. I do know that I do know that there's a Richard Molo because of his design is so strong and so iconic. And my design actually echoed that without me being assigned to design costume. My characters already echoed that because that's the design language of Star Wars. You cannot deviate from that. I really have problems when movies starts to deviate, from its core design. It's like, I'm going to use an analogy, a car analogy. It's, GM cannot do Porsches. That's just not done. They don't have that language. They don't have that down. They don't have that. They don't understand that. So, did it cause tension when George finally agreed to let me try out design? He gave me a week to come up with the design. And in that week, Aggie Rogers was brought in. Now, I had been working on it for almost a year, and Aggie Rogers was brought in, and during presentation, 7 days later, during presentation, I thought I would just be presenting to George and Richard. The entire pre-production from England was actually there. Norman Reynolds was there. The associate producer, the producer from England was there, and they were very much surprised that I was presenting costume design. And I'm almost sure that maybe there was tension in the air. Like, why is this kid doing that? Why is this even considered? And then during presentation, George took over. And when he started taking over, I knew that the design directions that I had taken was safe, because he understood everything to actually explain it. It's kind of like him telling a story that I don't know how to explain this. He took over the presentation as if he designed it himself. So he was comfortable with it. So at the end of the presentation, everybody left. It was an hour long or hour and a half long, and George was the last guy about to leave, and I said, "Hey, what does this mean?" And he said, "You got the job. You got 2 months to get it to London. See ya." That was it.
I heard sort of a catchphrase as you were presenting designs over those couple of months from George was asking you, "You have that in your budget?" What was that? What was that like?
Well, I started, because I'm familiar with the way. I guess I'm familiar enough with George that during pre-production, when there is no concept yet, you can just throw in anything. And sometimes it sticks and sometimes it doesn't. And so one of those concepts that I threw in was the Royal Guard. I didn't even have a title. It was just a guard. And it was because I run into a felt pen marker that was so beautiful, so red. And there's nothing red in Star Wars, that I wanted to use it. I mean, the red was calling me to design something with it. So out of that came the guard, and it finally became known as the Red Guard, because it was not written into the script. There was no script, and we're now done with scripts, right? Where the script is now locked down. So this is not pre-production design when Joe, Ralph, and I would present ideas to George. This is now about how do we manufacture these things. So during the costume design presentation, there is that Red Guard. And George looked at it and he was kind of puzzled, where is this in the script? And I told him, the throne room is black, the emperor is black, Darth is black, and against the blackness of space and behind them, that was my reasoning. But actually, it was because I had a red marker that was so fun to play with. So I said, George, that's why there's this Red Guard, to just put color in that set, in that scene. And when I was backing into from a producerial issue, I was backing into a certain number, that a certain budget. So George was really concerned, do I have that in my budget? And I lied, and I said, yeah. Of course I don't.
Can I ask, what's the difference for you? How did you have to approach differently designing things that the visual effects wizards at ILM would take over versus working with Aggie Rogers to actually create tangible costumes that people wear?
So I'm not really a costume designer. I'm a designer, right? Mm-hmm. So I look at the totality of the picture, and I understand the design language from a set, from a product, from the ship, from the size of the windows, from all of these, all the way down to costume. Now, can I cut a piece of cloth? No, I can't cut a piece of cloth. That's what Aggie Rogers was. She brought in the expertise of really putting together, a costume shop, a production costume shop. That I don't know. That's kind. Yeah.
Oh, go ahead. No, go ahead. No, I thought you'd.
What's that?
Oh, no. Please go ahead. I can listen to you all day.
In designing cars, we kind of understand what the production limitation is, what the production capability is. Speaking as a car designer for General Motors, I know what General Motors can do. I know what the production line can do. But that's not my concern. My concern is that the fashion trend in Tokyo, the fashion trend in Milan, the fashion trend in Stuttgart, in Paris looks like this. How does it relate to the car that we're making that's going to be released 6 years from now? That's my concern. Now, how the door opens, the mechanical aspect of that, we have engineers to do that. So I can't I cannot concern myself with that. There are other people that concern themselves with those. So I never. How would I deliver this without Aggie? I couldn't. And so the costume shop was divided into hardware because it's Star Wars. There are some hard things, hard objects, hard materials that had to be made, and the soft fabric things that had to be made.
With Return of the Jedi, there's two costumes in specific I want to ask you about really fast. One is Luke's costume, his black costume that sort of has the vest piece that sort of folds over and shows that lightness on it. And a lot has been talked about the symbolism of that. And I'm wondering how much of that is conscious in the design and what your thoughts were behind putting that really iconic costume together.
You're going to have to ask George, because it's actually George who came up with that idea that, Jack Palance had this costume on Shane. That it's kind of like a Western bib, that you can unclip or they snap on together. They form like, and he really liked that idea. So, all I did was adapted that idea from him. And it was his idea that Luke will be introduced in complete black. So that was a very easy design assignment,
The other one I wanted to ask about was the Biker Scout, right? What were the challenges of needing that required you to design that in the first place? And then what I think that's another one of those really iconic designs from the movie. What was the process behind that one?
So the process of that was, Lando and his gang was going to attack the Death Star. Meanwhile, Han is causing havoc over in this moon planet where the generator is kept. That would turn off the basically open the door over there, the Death Star. So while there are two simultaneous scenes going on, and in the scene where Han is trying to cripple the security system, back in this moon planet that with dense forest, George casually throw in, and then there was a chase. And I go, who is chasing who and what and how? And he goes, and that's George. And he goes, well, I'll see you guys in 2 weeks. So, are they racing around in a dune buggy? Are they racing around in a, So Joe and I started conceptualizing what that would be. And it turned into a bike. And, you have to have a biker. And how dangerous is this bike, and how iconic is this bike, so that, Star Wars would own it. It doesn't look like anything else. And, at that time, I was more focused on what the vehicle looked like. Occasionally I would draw in a guy. I would draw in, and it would never. It never really worked when I put in a stormtrooper riding it. It just looked clumsy. So it needed something light-footed and leaner, more biker-like and less robotic-like. And that's what I came up with. And the whole idea there was if you look at a racing horses have blinders, have side blinders in their eyes. So they can only look forward. They cannot glance side to side. I have no idea why that is. I guess horses are nervous when they see another horse next to them. I have no idea. So I just took that idea that there are blinders and these guys have blinders. So out of that blinder became that, that helmet.
I know you don't have a lot of time left. I want to be respectful of that. I've got two questions for you. I don't know how quick your answers are going to be because I'm not sure what you're going to say. But the first one is, can you take me through when you left ILM or when you left Lucasfilm? Sort of what projects did you work on for Lucasfilm, and if you were to sum up your experience working for Lucasfilm over that amount of time, how would you describe that?
I'm scratching my head. I never really thought about it. As a designer, I just look at what needs to be designed and by when, and how is it with George? How is it going to be perceived? What is its visual value? What is it supposed to visually say? Because it, as a product, you pick it up and you use it to shave your face, right? So it's a different requirement. In movies, it has to say what it wants to say before the actor actually uses it, and then when he uses it, the audience goes, "Whoa!" So there's the initial perception of what that product is going to be, and then there is and then there's that plus that when the product is finally used or that gun is finally used, you go, "Wow, that's really amazing." So I never really thought much about what we were doing. I didn't know anything about what is optical until I was in the middle of all of that, optical machinery that was ILM and now slowly becoming digital. And pretty soon optical was gone, and I sort of straddled that two different worlds, the transition of that two worlds, and that's probably how I would couch my experience at ILM, because the guys that I met that has gone at ILM or has worked at ILM, but has never been part of the initial, Star Wars or Empire or Jedi, they don't understand that optical concept at all. That analog filmmaking. Whereas I straddled that two worlds. I straddled that transition so much so that I was able to then move on and make games for EA. There is no analog there. Everything is digital there. So that's probably the best way to explain my experience there. But at the time, no, it's just a bunch of cool young kids, doing something that I didn't know didn't exist anywhere else in the world. One thing that I like about film or movie making is that you will only get on with that people one time in your entire life. You're never going to work with those people or that situation or again ever. You might work with one or two again, but never the entire crew. Mm-hmm. So what I've learned is to get on as quickly as possible with people, you know. And the only rudder, the only thing that guides us is this written paper, you know, the script. So, you know, when I moved into game design, it was very different. I think probably because in games, it's the very young kids designing games, and whereas in movies, it takes years to become a production designer. It takes hundreds and hundreds of hours as a draftsman, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of hours as a assistant director, until finally you become an art director, and then finally you become a production designer. So by the time you get there, you're pretty ready to do what you're supposed to do. In games, they just sort of arrive, and you know, in movies, meetings are held with minimum number of people. And those minimum number of people decide what the movie is going to be. And those minimum number of people have a gang, a horde of people underneath them, and they follow that direction. I noticed in games, which really shocked me, was everybody's in the same room, you know, and so the process of game becomes really sticky and takes so much time, whereas in movies, it is director driven. It only goes one way. This is my point of view. We do it this way.
So the last question I wanted to ask you about is not necessarily Star Wars related or anything, or even Lucasfilm, although I think it might be. I heard a story that you had convinced Otomo Katsuhiro to do an adaptation of Domu with Bandai, and that you got David Lynch to write it. And I'm wondering, was it on those initial meetings of David Lynch in Return of the Jedi that you met him to approach him for that? And why did that fall apart?
Yeah, it's Hollywood, man. You know, there are more, you know, honestly, Bryan, there are more interesting stories about how movies are not made, you know.
Yeah.
And then you and I sit down and watch a movie and you go, why was that made? That is so bad. Why was that made? Well, that's so bad in so many levels, but yet it was made. Why? I met David and somehow made an impression on David that we stayed in contact. You know, I met David when George introduced me to David, and David used to cut his film at the Rams. And, you know, occasionally David would show me rough cuts and you know, when I was in LA doing production design, I would come and visit him and he would show me rough cuts of his movies. We stayed in contact. So when the opportunity to do Dome was, you know, somehow, it somehow miraculously happened, you know, I took it to David because this is David's territory. This is not mine. I was merely a conduit to get things happen. So, you know, Bandai gave me a full production budget. They threw in prints and they threw in advertising. I'm not bondable as a producer, and I certainly wouldn't want to be producing that kind of movie first time out. So I met with David at Dupar's. Dupar's is a really old-time diner over in Ventura Boulevard, with really old-time waitresses, with old-time waitress costume. It's like you step into 1950s. And, I told David the opening scene, and before I could finish the opening scene, he said, I'm in. So I went back to Japan, and I told Otomo that we have, David will executive produce this. And he agreed. And, a script was written and was presented to Bandai, and then they gave me a turnaround. I have to be shooting within 12 months, or it reverts back to them. And David and I took it to Propaganda Films. They were the production company that did Wild at Heart for him. Unbeknownst to me, though, David and Propaganda Films relationship was beginning to come apart, I think, at the time. And Propaganda was more interested in my sweetheart being Bandai. They were more interested. Why did Bandai give you this? This being, full production, full, marketing and print. And I'm nobody. So they were more interested in getting that deal from Bandai than making the movie for David and I. So it kind of started to come apart, and finally my attorney told me, you need to walk away from this. They're offering you money to walk away from this. Walk, because the turnaround, they're never going to be able to shoot this. I'm never going to be able to get this shooting within so many weeks, because the turnaround deadline is coming. Yeah. So, yeah, I walked away and decided I'm done with movies.
Was that surfing. When was that? I mean, was that in your time? This was after your time at Lucasfilm, I guess?
No, this was many, many years later after Lucasfilm. A few years after Lucasfilm, I got hold of Bandai because I had a project with George. And, he greenlit my project within Lucasfilm. But instead of using George's money, I decided I'm going to go to Japan and get my money from this toy company to produce this movie, because, I like Bandai. I grew up in the Philippines playing with Bandai toys, and Bandai was still not visible in the U.S. at that time. So I thought the best way to bring Bandai in is through Lucasfilm. And I convinced Bandai that this is the best thing for them also, And through this project, there will be excuse me?
Oh, go ahead. No, go ahead.
This project basically allies Lucasfilm and Bandai together. So I'm able to use Lucasfilm's production and using Bandai to produce the movie. And the movie didn't go anywhere, but my relationship with Bandai was still intact, and they went on to actually finance that project that I was doing at Lucasfilm, but that too fell apart.
Mm-hmm. What was the project, if I may be so bold to ask?
The project was called Cyber, and ultimately, like a lost planet, it orbited back, and a few years later, something like 6 or 8 years later, the turnaround for that property came back to me, and Bandai paid for the turnaround, and we took it to Fox Kids Network.
Mm-hmm.
And the hero in this story, it was written by Eric Luke, the guy who did the writer who did Explorers, that was directed by Joe Dante. And
Mm-hmm.
anyway, so where was I? Oh,
it had gone back into turnaround at Fox Kids.
Oh,
or
so
you've taken it to Fox Kids.
So we took it to Fox Kids Network, and the hero of this story is a 7-year-old boy. And the 7-year-old boy is partnered with a very old, wizened machine that knows the history of the world that is lost. When the story began, the world is already lost. The history of the world is lost. In other words, it's the Dark Ages. We don't know how we got here. We don't know anything about writing. We don't know anything about, but we were once that. We were once knowledgeable. That knowledge is contained in this machine. But this machine is beholding to this boy. And this machine is the size of a ball that the boy stick into the end of his stick and beats people up because he's a kid. He doesn't know anything about this thing. He just look at this thing as a talking metal. But in that metal holds the entire history and therefore the redemption of the world, or therefore the renaissance of the world. So, it requires a naive boy who just wants to be a boy, and a machine that wants to recover the world so that the world will be back to where it was before. So it was a beautiful story, but it required the boy to be a boy. It required the boy to be 7 years old. When we took it to Fox Kids Network, everything had been written, all the design had been done. Because I spent time at Lucasfilm doing this. I think I spent 2 years doing this at Lucasfilm, including Eric and Phil. So there was a considerable amount of work already done and laid down, and the Bible and the characters and the backstory already done. By the time we got to Fox Kids Network, Fox decided that they cannot live with a 7-year-old boy. They wanted the 7-year-old boy to be a 15-year-old boy. And they were wondering why the hero does not talk a lot. And the hero should be given all the punchline. And I said, this is not Friends. This Friends was, the thing, this is not about a glib kid. This is not about a smart alecky kid. This is just about a kid who wants to be a kid. So, because they own the rights, because they own the rights, they said, no, we want it to be 15-year-old boy. And I knew then that project was dead. So they went on and produced, 37 episodes, 38, 40 episodes. and it didn't go anywhere.
I sort of, last question I'll ask, and I'll cut you loose, and thank you so much for your time and putting up with my questions. If you had to say that the chief thing that working with George Lucas taught you over your career, that maybe you still carry with you to this day, what do you think that would be?
So it would be something like this. Until I met John Hughes, I didn't know George Lucas. I met John Hughes towards the end of my my film thing. It would be this. George taught me how to build a box. John taught me how to open that box.
You're going to have to explain that for me. What,
George is a magic. George is about magic. You know, what's inside that box? You know, John is about words. And without words, without the written words, without the words connecting words to each other to become a sentence, to become a paragraph, to become a script, there is no magic. And John was an amazing writer, and George was an amazing magician. You know, so George, if you look at Star Wars, incredibly magical box. You know, when you look at John's movies, and the reason I was very interested in hooking up with John was I wanted to learn how to make simple movies, how to make Home Alone movies, you know, how to make 16 Candle movies.
You two tried to get tickets put together, right?
Yeah, the Tickets was the last production that I did with John. No, after Tickets, we tried to put together Peter Pan, but Tickets was it could have been done for nickel. It could have been done for a dime. You know, beautiful movie about lining up for tickets for this one beautiful venue of a theater. And we meet these people lining up for tickets, you know, overnight. And by the time the theater opens, the movie is done. You know, so it happens literally one night, and we get to know the people, and we get to know the world, and we get to know how people solve these problems of being people. Beautiful, you know. Incredibly beautiful and poetic movie. I wanted to do that, and that was my last assignment with John. You know, set up the production in New York. We're going to go shoot this movie in New York, but it never happened. So,
like I said, I will cut myself off, and I could probably speak all day. I'm absolutely fascinated by this and your career, and your work. Like I said in the email, has been something that's been fueling my dreams since I was a little kid, and really, really appreciate the time you've been able to give me.
Thank you.
Yeah, it was just a really fun time. For those of you looking for me, this weekend, actually, if you happen to be in the Denver area, I will be at a gaming convention called Genghis Con as a guest of honor with Mike Stackpole. Will be there for Battletech and Star Wars, playing games with folks, and would love to see folks there. And then next week I'll be at a writing convention in Salt Lake called StoryCon. And I think there's going to be a couple more conventions next month for me. And I'd love to see folks there. And yeah, you can find my schedule at swankmotron.com. And as far as Full of Sith goes, you can go to fullofsith.com, download the entire back catalog of episodes, and, be sure to send us an email. We'd love to hear from you at holocron@fullofsith.com. And be sure to rate and review the show wherever it is you, listen to it. Tell your friends about it, that sort of thing. And so for super producer Mike Pilot and for Holly Fry, I'm Bryan Young, and the Force will be with you always.
Sir, if you'll not be needing me, I'll close down for a while.